Good evening and welcome to today's BIC streams for our discussion on who is Kabir and where should we look to find him. Today we're honored to have with us three respondents to the question whose life work has centered around the traditions of North Indian Bhakti poetry. Professor John Stratton Hawley, coming to us from New York City, informally called Jack Hawley by everyone. Shabnam Birmani from Bangalore, and Professor Linda Hess from Berkeley, California. Professor Hawley will begin with the historical Kabir of the 15th century and the manuscripts that were written after his death. Shabnam will follow. She will sing for us, offer some reflections from her research and travels, and show us some clips from her filmmaking and documentation of the oral tradition. And Professor Linda Hess will then share with us her current work on a 400-year-old manuscript from a private collection in Jaipur. I'll introduce each one of them before they speak, and then at the end, we will have some time for a discussion and questions. Do write to us with your questions and comments. We would love to hear from you. So, to begin with, some context. The name Kabir means great. And as Professor Hawley has pointed out, the early anthologies and biographies show that his greatness was perceived differently by different people. In our own time, we have representations of him that range from a contemplative, inward-looking, saintly figure all the way to an angry maverick rebel on the road like Jack Kerouac, American writer of the Beat Generation. Before I turn to our speakers to hear their responses to the opening question, I should mention that they have been fellow travelers on this journey in search of Kabir. And when we were planning this session, Linda Hess wrote a note that I'd like to share with you. She says she's happy to be teamed up today with Jack Hawley and Shabnam Birmani. She met Jack at a 1978 conference on Bhakti literature in Berkeley, where she gave her first public presentations on Kabir, which later became her first publications. She says that Jack's smiling face, his profound knowledge, and his phenomenal output of work in our field have been a joyous presence in her life ever since. She met Shabnam in Malwa, Madhya Pradesh in 2002. During 3 days of rushing through villages and listening to Kabir singers, they had so much fun that they haven't stopped meeting every year since then in villages and cities in South Asia and North America, making films, writing books, and celebrating their good luck. Good luck that what they call work is to be immersed in the poetry, song, and culture of Kabir. So with that spirited prelude, let me introduce our first speaker. Professor Jack Hawley is Claire Tao Professor of Religion at Barnard College, Columbia University, and has written, I believe, 7 books on India's Bhakti traditions. I remember being inspired as a young graduate student by Songs of the Saints of India, which he wrote with Mark Juergensmeyer. There's also 3 Bhakti voices on Mirabai, Surdas, and Kabir, which I have here. And more recently, A Storm of Songs, India and the Idea of the Bhakti Movement from Harvard University Press in 2015. Earlier this year, his book, Krishna's Playground, Vrindavan in the 21st Century, was published by Oxford. Above all, I'd like to say that there is a luminous and gracious quality to Jack's work. His talk today is titled Kabir's Ram and his Loom. So, Professor Hawley.
Thanks for that more than gracious introduction, and an introduction from more than one side. It's quite something to be in contact with you halfway around the world, or maybe not quite halfway around the world because Linda is the rest of the halfway. It's just amazing. Pratiti, you and I last met in Bangalore, as a matter of fact. You know, it says something about the world, especially in this moment when we all find ourselves so isolated in our individual rooms. And therefore, I think isolated in our individual mind rooms, to be reminded that we are not actually individuals, but part of a broader fabric and part of the fabric of my own personal life, I see before me right now. Starting recently with that meeting in the Bangalore temple and going back way, way back through the films that Shabnam, you have made, those 4 luminous films, which I am constantly showing to my class and then having them see them for the first time. So I get to see them all over again. And who is a major presence in those but Linda, whom, as Linda has said, I've known since 1978. You quite rightly said, Pratiti, that she made her first presentations publicly at that conference. I think you used the singular. Actually, all of us made 1 presentation, except for Linda, who made 2 presentations. So, you know, there is excellence right at the beginning, and it has continued right now. And so I'm trying to say this is a kind of family. And where does that bring us in relation to Kabir? There's something about Kabir, I think, that always stands alone. When I imagine him in Banaras, watching the crowds go by and thinking what he thinks. It's very often a lonely Kabir who observes that. And yet, the tradition of bhakti literatures in India has held that he's one of many bhaktas. So what I'd like to do in thinking about who was Kabir and where can we find him is actually to begin with 2 of his bhakti friends, let me put it that way, bhakti associates, Mirabai and Raidas or Ravidas, and begin with a poem from each of those that has something to do with his specific point of identity in the world. One of the fabulous things about India's bhakti tradition is that it's not just a tradition of poetry and therefore song, it's also a tradition of lives. There's the sense that somehow you can't sing without it's coming out of you. You can't sing without it's happening at a particular point in time and in relation to a particular person. And yet that too turns out to be a mystery. The song may travel, may take a little bit different form, but it's also true that the person travels and takes different forms. So maybe I've sort of wondered, Pratiti, why Kabir? How did this happen? Why wasn't it Sur? Why wasn't it Raidas? Why wasn't it Mira or Andal? I don't know the answer to that, but I suspect that it's something about the unique universality of Kabir, which has to do with his aloneness, but that aloneness similarly is shared with others. So let me begin with a sort of alap from Mirabai. It's a particular poem of Mira that I've thought of because of where I've been in the last few months. And let me tell you where that was. So I teach in New York, I live in New York. There was a point when New York was the absolute epicenter of the COVID pandemic, as you know. And that was the point when education at Barnard and Columbia, where I teach, went online. It was the time when our daughter feared most for our lives and urged us to get out if we could. And very luckily, what does that make us? 1.5% of any given population? Very luckily, we had a place to go to. My family has had a summer house in Western Michigan for over a century now. I share it with my family, but believe me, no one was there in the month of March. This is not summer by our calculations, but it was a place to go, a very lonely place to go. And I found myself surrounded there with some familiar faces, but mainly with few faces. It was a very lonely place. But what I found myself surrounded with was what we typically in English call nature. What is nature? All of these live beings who take their shape in relation to each other in different ways as the seasons move. Every day, typically at the end of the day, I go out for an hour-long walk and would reacquaint myself with this surround that I found myself in, which in some way harkened back to my years going there for a week or two as a child, and in some other ways was completely new. I had no idea what this world really was. The crickets, the frogs, the little flowers that I never saw in the summer, how they would come, develop, and grow. It was a lonely existence, something like Kabir's loneliness, but it was also a new kind of communal existence with some part of the world that we simply forget about if we live in New York. And maybe it even happens in Bangalore, despite your great gardens. we forget that we're surrounded by something that precedes human civilization altogether. And this, of course, is the great challenge of our moment. Will it end up succeeding human civilization in a time that's much closer to our present time than we may realize? I think I found as I walked around that it's the voice of Kabir that more than any other voice prepares us to live in such a world where in encountering the beautiful shapes of the world and also its sociality, the people, we at the same time have to think about, oh my gosh, how alone I am, how alone we are, and how we're not going to be here all that long. So now going back to the community of people with whom Kabir is associated in my mind, I want to just say a word about Mira, then about Raidas, and then come back to Kabir, and choose as a point of departure in each case a poem that to me says something about the particular position of that particular poet in relation to her life or his. Let's start with Mira. Everyone knows that Mira is totally involved in Krishna. She's classically a Saguna poet for whom everything is sa and nothing is nir, because always Hari is there for everything. Well, there I was out in the wilderness, as they might call it, out among the leaves, or actually before the leaves even were, just those sticks of trees. I would think of Mira. It's a monsoon poem, and you'll see that she depicts herself in her typically, she uses the word kari. She's standing there, but also she's kind of stubborn as she stands, and she looks out at the landscape. She sees it all as Krishna. Here's the poem. बादल देखा झरी श्याम मैं बादल देखा झरी काला पीला घटिया उमरिया प्रस्योपचार करी जित जोया तित पानी पानी प्यासा भूम हरी. Ah, there's that hari. प्यासा भूम हरी मीरा रे प्रभु हरि अविनाशी करस्यो प्रीत करी. We tried translating that many years ago, and here's how it came out. I saw the dark clouds burst, dark Lord, saw the clouds, and tumbling down in black and yellow streams they thicken, rain and rain, 2 hours long. See, my eyes see only rain and water, watering the thirsty earth green. Me, my love's in a distant land, and wet I stubbornly stand at the door, for Hari is indelibly green, Mira's Lord, and he has invited a standing, stubborn love. There's that word khari, standing and stubborn at the same time. And you see how the colors fit together. She sees, she sees the pila in the sky, and then she sees the kala in the sky. And if you mix pila and kala in your little paint set, what do? You get hari. So she's mixing with the world that she feels herself a part of, and as she mixes, she finds that Hari is everywhere. She's waiting for Krishna. She's always in that waiting mode. So that's one of the people on our bhakti stage. Now, let's take a look at another favorite of mine, and someone who pulls us a little closer to Banaras, where I imagine Kabir to be standing impatiently waiting for us. This is Raidas. Probably in the same, I think these are all 16th century saints. We have some disagreement about that at the table. We'll get into that in a moment. I think they're all 16th century saints. Here is Raidas. It's going to be a very different kind of scene. Oh, Raidas ji kahan? And this is a poem that comes out of his identity. And what is his identity? He is a chamar. He is someone who makes shoes. He is someone who deals with leather. Someone whose position in a streetscape, well, you may not even see him. He may be sitting or crouching farther down on the street than you're apt to see as you walk by. It's quite a position to be in life. Here's what he says about that position in this particular poem, which is archived in many places, but I'm going to read from the version that is in the Guru Granth Sahib of the Sikhs. Chamarata, whoa. There's the identity word right away. chamar, chamarata, a particular kind of shoe. Chamarata ganthi na janai, log gathawe pani, aar nahi jio ropo, nahi rambi tho ropo. Log ganti ganti khada bigucha, हाँ तो गांठे जाए पहुंचा रविदास जपे राम नामा मोहि जम सेओ nahi kama. Let me try a translation of that. It comes right out of his identity. He's thinking about the wider implications of being who he is. Unlike Mira, he's not going to find that the world envelops him as a whole and answers to who he is. He's not going to find that the world has all the colors that he, she is inside, but something rather different. He steps back from that world, from his own occupation. These days, we tend to think of Ravidas in a good sort of Marxist way as a good shoemaker. He's always busy at his work. Well, but listen to what he actually says. I've never known how to tan or sew, though people come to me for shoes. I haven't the needle to make the holes or even the tool to cut the thread. Others stitch and knot. The word gunt is here. Others stitch and knot and tie themselves in knots, while I, who do not knot, break free. I keep saying Ram and Ram, says Ravidas, and death keeps his business to himself. So, the work situation into which he has been born is a work situation that he disavows. He sees it in what everybody does. People tie themselves in knots. We are all shoemakers. We're all using that thread. And he stands back and says, no, I keep saying Ram, Ram. And Yama, death, keeps its business to himself. Who is this Ram? There's nothing to indicate in the poetry, the old poetry of Ravidas, that this is the Ram of the Ramayana. This is Ram in a stronger, more universal sense, the Ram that rhymes with Nam, calling upon the Nam, the name of the Lord, and it comes out as Ram. Maybe it's related to the Ram of the Ramayana, but you would never particularly know it from Ravidas. One of the things that I think about as I think about his particular position in time and space, being a Banarsi, is how much he would have heard the name of Ram on the streets. Ram Nam Satya Hai. And it leads, of course, it celebrates death. It announces death. So there's that in the background too, but it's the Satyaness of the Ram that he's pointing to. I keep saying Ram and Ram, says Ravidas, and death keeps his business to himself. Wow, so imagine having bhakti friends like that. Where is Kabir going to fit in this landscape? So we're going to be hearing quite a bit of Kabir, but let me just give a couple of short ones that I've been thinking about. And this has to do, of course, with his location in his world, and his location is as a weaver. And there's no dispute about the fact that by occupation, Kabir was a julaha, a weaver, or kodi, as he is sometimes called. And no dispute about the fact that he is doing this work in Banaras. He mentions Kashi all the time. He specifically says he is leaving Kashi to go to God-forsaken Maghar. That is a statement about what it meant to live in Kashi for him. He surely is not, so far as I know, in Faridabad, not far from Delhi, although if you turn to Wikipedia, someone has gotten the idea that Kabir is sitting in Faridabad and has introduced it into the first paragraph of what you read on Wikipedia. No. I mean, I would love to know how that idea came up. Maybe someone knows in this group, but I sure don't. He's a Banarsi, as far as I can see. How could he be anything else? And that puts him in a world center, a kind of New York of his time, a Bangalore of his time, where the world went by on the streets right in front of him. What does he say about all that? What does he say about being a weaver in such a situation? Here's a doha. Kabir jati chulaha kya kare? Kabir jati chulaha kya kare? Hriday base gopal. Kabir ramaya khanta milu, Chuk hi sarab janjal. So once again, like Raidas, he's stepping back, but in even fewer words. So I'm born a weaver, so what? I've got the Lord in my heart. A man with Ram in his throat, free from every snare. Is that what I actually read? Did anybody say Gopal, the Lord? Well, Gopal, it's definitely a Vaishnava designation. Kabir Ramaya Kantamilu, there it is, the Kant. Chukahi Sarva Janjal. I'm going to try one of the just very short one. I think Linda may be turning to this one too. This is a great one. I won't read the whole thing. There's more plot in this one. Tanna bunna tajyo Kabir. Rama nama liki liyo sarir. There it is again. He's leaving behind this tanna bunna. Rama nama liki liyo Kabir. We hear that Kabir never was a writer. Well, maybe he wasn't, or maybe he was. But in any case, he says in this particular bit of poetry, he's written the name of Ram all over his body. And then about Ram, just one more little brief segment comes to mind. And this has to do with his relationship with the Pandits. Could be the Qazis, religious professionals, maybe people who teach religious studies like I do, this sort of, they spend their life with books. He has no patience for it, particularly when they advertise this prestige in a public setting, when they allow someone to give a little introduction as Pratiti so kindly did, the number of books that have been produced. Can you imagine Kabir listening to that? Oh, he would turn his face and think, I can't stand it. And yet we have a lot of poems from him. Here's a little something. This has to do with the Pandits. Jehi Marga Pandit gaye, tehi gaye bahir, agat ghati Ramaki. Tehi chari raha Kabir. Agat ghati. And that wonderful word bahir. Here's a bit of a translation before we go on. The Pandits have taken a highway that takes them away, and they're gone. Kabir has climbed the impossible pass of Ram and stayed. So there are a number of contrasts in this poem. He sees the world go by, all these Pandits, imagine himself in Banaras, and then the Bahir come along with them, all of the sort of paraphernalia that you need when an army is on the move, all that sort of luggage. So the people who follow the Pandits like me, they're just the luggage that goes along with these Pandits. And what does Kabir do? He climbs up, he uses the word climb, to the Agat Ghati, to the impossible pass of Ram, and stays. Is this a military metaphor? Is he getting ready for an attack? Has he gone up to some pass and he's just waiting for those armies to pass in front of him, maybe? Is it a reference to his own practice of retreating into himself in disciplined bodily fashion, as the yogis did, the not yogis did? Or is it a different kind of a retreat, a more total retreat, where he discovers what remains, raha, what remains, and then wants to remain where that Ram is? So let's switch now for the few minutes that are left. And I see the Pandit has already talked too long. Pandits do this, I'm sorry to say. Let's just talk a little bit about the history of Kabir and where we might actually find him if we were trying to think about him as an individual. I do think it's very important, of course, that many, many people have sung Kabir songs from their own inner Kabir. And yet, I think it's impossible to think of Kabir or even Kabirness without imagining that some great person with a gift stood behind that panoply and spoke, actually, sang in Banaras. So let me try to divide the screen and see if I can take you to that very place. Banaras, there it is. This is when, happens to be January 1 of this current year when I was last in Banaras. Banaras, we know it from the Ganga. Oh my gosh, Kabir has a few things to say about that too. We know it from the temples. This is in Vishwanath Dham, as it is now called, Modi's raising of much of Banaras in the center of the city. And one of the good things about it is that one can see some of the temple structures from before. But when I think of Kabir, I think of him in the gullies with all the people going by. Here's a woman with a sweeping stick. Surely he would have noticed that. Bicycles, I think he would have liked. And certainly Pahalwan sweets. Who can not like Pahalwan sweets? And here's the Gyanvapi Mosque. Now, that's anachronistic in that it wasn't built until the time of Jahangir in the 17th century, but there would certainly have been mosques there, and Kabir's Muslimness is very important to the historical Kabir. How is he imagined? He begins to appear in a sort of icon, an icon of his being a weaver. So we have to think of that loom somehow as being right next to one of the big streets of Banaras, where he hears all of this traffic and responds to it. People come by all the time, but he has his work to do too. In this 19th century illustration done in the region of Jaipur, I understand, he's shown, of course, like out in the open country, strangely. Must we always have our saints be in the open country somewhere and not part of city life? There he is, and he's shown with Pipa on the right and with Namdev just to the right of Kabir as we see him, and to his proper right, our left, is Raidas. That image actually has a specific, how shall I say, tag that it adopts. Here's a simpler form that has been worked into that larger image. You can see the loom is proceeding in the same direction. This is from the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. And here's a detail of the version that you can see in the National Museum in Delhi, where again he is attended by Raidas. You see how thin he is and how withdrawn he seems to be in relation to his womb, his loom. One of the most interesting early illustrations of Kabir, however, is this one, earlier than any, I think, that we have seen so far, and yet it quotes something earlier than itself. This remarkable page is now in the collection of the V&A, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. It's typically dated to about 1650 and associated with the artist called Khwaja Sahib, although he doesn't actually sign it. And Kabir is down at the very bottom. We'll be looking at him in a moment, but let's take a look at the scene as a whole, which is, we are obviously seeing a kind of fana. We're seeing a dance of Sufis, which is observed by some of the very great figures of the time, including, we think, Qadris and Chishtis. So that fits with the identifications of the Mughal family. Actually, maybe this was done in the atelier of Dara Shikoh. And up here in the very corner are gringos like me, Britishers or Portuguese perhaps, who are also part of this scene. So already in the middle of the 17th century, Kabir is being associated with these foreigners and this very complex scene, which has as its center a kind of religiosity that is at home in Islam. What is Kabir doing there? Here we see him a little bit at the bottom. My house is that this of worthy, you see at the bottom, we think of being a sect at all, and he was not of a sect. I think of him as a kind of Vulgate Vaishnava. Vaishnava in an inclusive, particularly, say a Sagun Vaishnava in the way that Mirabai is. So here is Kabir, and next to him is his son, Kamal, and next to him is Namdev once again, and once again Raidas, way at the edge. So these three have been transported into the Jaipur image that we're used to seeing. All got original, so I think it's Kinaram Baba, as I've learned from Shankar here at Columbia. So an Augad who's Vaishnavas, indeed, Ram established monastery, both now Augadi in one sense, Gaudiya in one sense, and Vaishnava in the other. So he belongs. Over on the other side, we see Matsyendranath. So these are the Nath yogis, which were associated so closely with Kabir by Hazare Prasad Dwivedi, and Gorakhnath, and then finally Jagrup or Chidrup, who we know benefited from, well, or was it the other way around, a visit by the Mughal Emperor Jahangir in the year, I think it was 1617. In any case, it's a very interesting way of positioning Kabir at the center of this, but at the bottom, as a complement to what's going on in the Islamic realm. What I love about this is that it's neither Hindu nor Turk, so to speak, but in some way both. And that, of course, resonates to Kabir's poetry itself. And that depiction of Kabir was not forgotten. Here in Lucknow, in the latter half of the 18th century, we see another kind of rendition of this same group of, I want to say Vaishnavas, but the Shaivas or Nath yogis have been replaced by musicians. Here they are. But over on the other side, it's our same group once again, these four. Here's the Aghori once again, and there's Kabir. Now look at Kabir's elbow. Look at this elbow. Why does he have his elbow like that? Is it because it originally rested on a yoga dant, perhaps? A yogi's stick? Or could it be that this motion that we see without the motion has been quoted from the earlier image that we saw of Kabir at the Loom? That's actually what I think we're seeing. So let's see if we can, no, sorry, my slides won't do it. You'll have to have that Loom in mind. His being a weaver then is being represented here, even in the absence of his loom. One last slide that I want to show you is this. I've already mentioned the name of Hazare Prasad Dwivedi. Absolutely, totally important scholar. Linda has actually talked with Acharya of Hindi literature. And I think more important than any other single person for the crystallization of the idea of the Bhakti movement, or Bhakti Ka Andolan, as he called it, Bhakti Andolan. For Hazare Prasad, Kabir did not stand entirely alone. He was a part of the Vaishnava world because of his own guru. And that guru was Ramanand. And it was Ramanand who made a connection with the greater Vaishnava tradition of the South. Here on the southern wall of the Hindi Bhavan at Shantiniketan, established by Tagore and overseen by Hazare Prasad Dwivedi in the mid-1940s when this was done, here we see Ramanand, so to speak, giving birth to the Bhakti movement. And he passes his wisdom on to Ramanand, and Ramanand passes it on to Kabir. Here we see that the elbow is in a little bit different position. I wonder if here Kabir has not been liberated from his weavership by Hazare Prasad, who was in conversation with Vinod Bihari Mukherjee, who was the actual artist for these paintings. We see him as a kind of yogi, perhaps even a Nath yogi, but the fascinating thing is that he's on the southern wall, as if he belongs to that great southern tradition. And then as the mural proceeds, we'll see Banaras take shape and finally end up on the opposite wall in the north with who else? Guru Gobind Singh. We've talked about the importance of Kabir for the Sikhs already. This was very much in the mind of Hazare Prasad as he thought about the Bhakti movement in his language as the sort of natural predecessor for the Indian nation. And the, how shall I say it, the reason that Hindi should have a special position among its languages. So, Kabir. Let me, I'm worried about time, so let me just say this. I'll only focus on one thing, and that is the matter of Ramanand, whom we just saw. Unlike the great Kabir scholar and performer, I do not think that Kabir was a pupil of Ramanand. I don't think we know that Kabir was a pupil of anyone. He was a pupil, I think, of the Satguru. And the reason I say this is that he makes no reference at all to Ramanand in his poetry, the poetry that comes to us from the early period, nor does Ramanand make any reference to him. Rather, the Ramanandis, who were shaping our sense of the history of bhakti at that point in time, they definitely saw Kabir as being the pupil of Ramanand, who was their guru. And the meaning of Ramanand's being their guru was that he tied them to the greater Vaishnava traditions of the South, namely Ramanujacharya. But I think it's made up. I think Kabir stands alone. He stands with the other bhaktas, as I've been saying, but not in the guru succession so far as I can see. There's one little hint in a line from Hariram Vyas, writing in Vrindavan at the end of the 16th century, that puts Kabir in connection with Ramanand. But even there, the proper reference to whom the term sevak, servant of, refers is probably Hari and not Ramanand. So I think we have to get rid of the idea that somehow Kabir belongs to the bhakti movement via Ramanand. He belongs because of who he is, rather. And let me just say one final thing about timing. I'm very conscious of the fact that I've just gone over mine. And that is the matter of what century Kabir lived in. People make a case for his being from the 15th century or even a bit of the 14th century. I just don't see how it's possible. His poetry, so far as we know it, all comes from the 16th century. I think that effort to associate him with an earlier period of time is part of the Ramanand story. You want Kabir to be earlier so that he can have a connection to Ramanand, who will have a connection to Ramanuja. I think it's made up. It's a noble artifice, but I think it's made up. If we actually look at Kabir, the date that sticks out is the date 1518 as being his death date. Why 1518? I think because it's a year after the death of Sikandar Lodi, about whom we have a fantastic story about Kabir's having to defend himself. He died in 1517. But that story is not history. We know it from early on, already at the end of the 16th century, but it isn't history. It's like a whole bunch of other stories that sound like it. Sikandar Lodi just happens to be the ruler who can be imported into that story and make it make sense. I don't think it's true. Then if you go to Wikipedia, you'll see that some scholars say, oh, he was born in 1440 and lived for about 50 years. Others say he died in 1518 and then had been alive for 60 years until then. All that does is to divide the lifespan that traditionally has been assigned to him, which is 120 years long, 1440 to 1518. But what does that mean, to live 120 years? The same thing is said of Ramanand. It means that this figure is so great that he lives 2 lifespans, 60 times 2. He's at least that much more a human being than we are. So I think we have to put aside those ideas and think of the Kabir who lived in Benares, I think in the 16th century, along with these other bhakti saints. Think of him as a part of a collective, but someone who truly stands apart. Let me leave it at that. I'll show you a last look at Kabir, where he is accompanied by a Raidas who seems to have arrived recently from the Arabian Peninsula. I cannot say, but I kind of like him there. Let's leave that Kabir.
Thank you, Jack, for that radiant insight into the historical Kabir and all of those wonderful miniatures that you've shown us and walked us through the visual record there. Up next, we have filmmaker, singer, and writer Shabnam Birmani, who has been exploring the philosophy of Kabir and other mystic poets through their oral folk traditions for close to 2 decades. With her extraordinary Kabir project, she has traveled and recorded and created 4 documentary films and a vast digital archive on mystic poetry and music. In India, where so little is documented and so much is lost, this invaluable collection reminds me of such efforts in other places, such as the Smithsonian's Folkways recordings in North America, or efforts in England after World War II to record work songs of trades like blacksmiths that were dying out. Shabnam's film, Kabira Khada Bazaar Mein, won the Special Jury Prize at the 52nd National Awards in 2011. She has co-authored 2 books and is currently working on a third with the interesting title, Burn Down Your House, Life Lessons from Kabir. She's constantly translating, writing, singing, curating, and organizing urban festivals and rural yatras, and more recently, she says, infecting her students at the Shrishti Institute of Art, Design and Technology, where she teaches, with the challenge and wonder of this poetry. Her performance is titled Shabd Ki Dor, the thread of the word. Over to you, Shabnam.
Thank you so very much. It's really a joy and an honor to be here with Linda and Jack. And thank you, Jack, for that setting the ground of the historical Kabir, because I'm going to move straight into cutting 600 years later to see what became of the words that the historical Kabir would have spoken, or we guess he would have spoken, or we study and research what did he say and who was really Kabir. So I'm going to try and squarely answer that question, who was Kabir, from the vantage point of the practitioners of the oral tradition that keep Kabir's poetry alive as songs in our country. And as we know, over 600 years, Kabir's words have morphed, have evolved, have transformed, have poured themselves into multiple dialects and languages of the entire, mid-western, eastern, western stretch, going all the way to Pakistan on one side and to Nepal in the north and to Bengal in the east. So his expressions keep shifting language flavors, dialects, and also pouring themselves into newer metaphors with the passage of time. So we have so many Kabir songs that have metaphors of things that seem anachronistic because they didn't exist back then, like trains or telescopes even. So what we are talking about is a kind of a vast body of living, thriving, pulsating, constantly evolving, constantly being added to body of verse, which in a sense one could say belongs in the commons, because people participate in it with a sense of ownership. So who is Kabir? If we try and answer that question from that vantage point, that's what I'll try and share here. And for that, I'll take you back to my research days in Malwa, in a village called Barandwa, where I was once sitting with a wonderful folk singer, Narayan Singh Delmia. With us was Dinesh, who was a social worker of a local NGO called Eklavya. And Dinesh happened to say, I am very confused because there are so many songs of the Kabir tradition which speak of Guru with such scorn and critique, and on the other hand, the same tradition speaks of Guru with such reverence. So we really need to undertake some serious research to find out what was the authentic voice of Kabir here. What was Kabir really saying about the Guru? So Narayanji, I remember, smiled. In fact, he started laughing and he said, ऐसे नहीं पता चलेगा तुम्हें authenticity का मामला. You're not going to figure out the authentic word of Kabir through that route, through the route of research and analysis and period analysis and all of that. And then he said, आप खुद शब्द पे चलिए, दूध का दूध और पानी का पानी हो जाएगा. walk the talk, walk what the Shabd says, and it will sift itself. It will become clear to you. So this is a validation, not so much of the authenticity of the poem, rather the relevance of it for your life. This speaks of a knowledge tradition where there is a resolute subjectivity that seeks no external yardsticks for validation of the authenticity of a poem or an experience. So evidently in the oral traditions, I feel what people seek is not so much the authentic word of a historical figure, Kabir, or even the words of the Guru, as the Sikh community has consecrated the words of Kabir in the Guru Granth Sahib. And they treat those words with deep reverence as the Bani, as the word of the Guru, not to be messed with, cannot be changed with, tampered with, not a matra here or there. The oral traditions are not seeking this authentic word. Rather, they are seeking self-revelation through participation. They are seeking the validation of the truth of the poem in their hearts. And another incident that I love to quote to demonstrate this quality of the oral traditions in its best practice is a moment when I was in a car. It was past midnight. Prahlad Tipania ji, who's this very well-known folk singer of Kabir, whom I have done a lot of research with, learned a lot of Kabir from. He was returning from a late night concert in some remote village. And with us in the car was a younger singer, Arun Goel. And the conversation started about a particular song which says, Jajo Jajo re ina samundara par, motira lajo anabindya. Go, my friend, go across the seas, bring back a pearl that is anabindya, meaning unpierced, unstrung. And interestingly, Arun Goel sings the same song saying, Motira lajo anabhinjya. Anabhinjya meaning unsaturated, untouched by the waters of the ocean. And a pretty long conversation, a discussion unfolded in that car ride between these two singers, the carriers of the oral tradition of Kabir, where they debated what would be the authentic word that Kabir would have used here, Anabindya or Anabhinjya. And let me just cut to the chase and say that after a long discussion, they mutually agreed that both words were accurate to the philosophy of Kabir and that both should therefore be sung, because Anabindya signals bringing back a pearl that stands alone, that is not compromised by being strung into a narrow framework of any kind. And Anabhinjya signals that quality of a seeker or seeking that belongs in the world, is in the bhavsagar of the world, but untouched by it, not wet. So I think this example really brought home to me in great clarity both the, what should I say, the vulnerability of the oral tradition to appropriation, to distortions, and at the same time, its strength and beauty. Strength because this is how people unlock the tradition for themselves from the ground of practice. And I think I might dare to even say it is truer to the spirit of Kabir to not search for the authentic Kabir, but to search for the spirit of Kabir in your own heart. And actually, I came across this wonderful image for the oral traditions listening the other day to a scholar, Milind Vakankar, and he said that the oral tradition is a bit like, the bank locker. In India, I don't know if this is true of the United States, but in India, when you put all your jewels away in a bank locker, it's always operated with a double key, okay? There is a master key, which the bank official has, that's Kabir. And you need your own key, and the two keys come together to unlock the treasures of this tradition for you. So we know that so many songs of the Kabir tradition have signatures of Kabir. Many contemporary songs are written with the signature of Kabir, but then we also have a lot of songs which have these double signatures. Kahe Dharam Das, paying a tribute to Kabir. So there are these two names that come up at the end of the song, which signal a tribute to that historical figure who passed, but a confident and assured claim to being an owner of the tradition, the oral tradition of Kabir, and participating in it. I'd like to also speak about a moment in Banaras. In fact, Linda, if you remember, we were in, I think, 2004 in Banaras shooting with you, and we did an interview with your collaborator, Dr. Shukdev Singh. And I remember he said something in that interview which really struck a chord, or rather I should say it really intrigued me. He said, Kabir समझने की चीज है जरूर, लेकिन उससे कहीं ज्यादा कबीर गुणने की चीज है. And I wasn't quite sure what he meant. Kabir, he's saying, a quick translation would be that Kabir is certainly a poet to be understood, but more than that, he must be hummed. Gunna brings in the idea of sound, of humming, of being drawn into sound or orality. And orality is certainly in the DNA of the Kabir tradition, or Kabir himself, for Kabir is constantly inviting us to listen all the time. Kahe Kabir, suno bhai sadho. Listen to what? To his poems, to his words, certainly, but then also to the Shabd, the word with capital W that is a difficult idea to translate. It signals a word, it signals a sound, it signals the primordial sound from which all of creation is spun, as the tradition speaks of it. It signals perhaps the substance of reality itself, moving beyond the dimension of sound even. In any case, it signals a vast universe of seeking and experience. So I'm not going to try and dare to, in a quick, shallow way, define what Shabd means. But I think it's also interesting that Shabd, in addition to signaling sound or primordial sound, also means poem, Shabad, literally the spoken word, an utterance, an oral poem, a devotional song, or Bani, Shabad Kirtan, that's where the term comes from. So today, what I thought I would try and do is inquire into the meanings of Shabd, both as that original sound, that ultimate reality, and as poem song in the context of the satsang in the oral traditions, and see where that takes us, what insights emerge. And why Shabd Ki Dor? Dor, tar, being a thread, a string, a cord. For that, I'd like to share a doha with you, which a sakhi, which I heard Prahaladji sing once, which really struck me. Makhdi utri tar se, tar tar chadhi jaye. Sant utre shabad se, ve shabad shabad chadhi jaye. I found this image of the spider and a thread very striking, rich with possibilities when juxtaposed with the idea of a seeker and the word. For it signals a movement on the thread of something delicate, something very fragile. Our attention, perhaps, to that which interconnects, weaves a web, something so subtle that it can almost be missed like a spider's web in the background till we bring our attention to it, our surta. Shabd as a subtle presence permeating the entire fabric of our existence and reality, unnoticed till we become aware of it, till we tune in, we listen. So, And this poem speaks of Uttarana, Uttare Shabd se, coming from somewhere, from some origin. But it also speaks of Chandhana, which is a much more frequent term in Kabir poetry, of climbing and upward movement. Many Kabir songs will signal that the Shabd can be heard in the sky, in the Gagan, that it is a sound very subtle that is resonating in the sky. In some other bhajans, he will say, Surat Dor Akash Chadhe, my attention climbs on the thread, on a thread to the sky. And we know that the sky he's referring to is both out there and in here. The sky is in the body. In yogic references, it is the inner space inside our skull domes. So sky is a metaphor for a state, an experience of ourself without borders. So I'd like to share a clip from our web Dunya Ajab Sheher of Prahaladji singing this iconic song of Kabir. So I'm going to share screen here. Hearing this Shabd is certainly an allusion to the experience of meditation, one would imagine. But I'd like to venture to say that to an extent, that is also what the satsang in the best practice of that tradition seeks to achieve. When groups of singers and listeners come together and imbibe the song in their bodies, singing, clapping, dancing, playing manjiras, feeling a sense of interconnection, becoming one with the sound, feeling it vibrate simultaneously in many bodies. Many boundaries and borders are dissolving in that moment between singers and listeners, between singer and song, sometimes between communities and castes, though not always, certainly flirting with that place of dismantling notions of self and other, intuiting some dissolution of separation between self and God, if one wants to use a term like that. And that is why satsangis will seek this space again and again, repeatedly. Because as our surta, our attention climbs to the sky, we experience the relief of a shedding of the burden of identities, of markers, of locativeness. So this is why a poem as song bears endless repetition. In satsang after satsang, year after year, decade after decade, we return to singing the same song. And what is being refreshed here is not so much an intellectual reminder of the meaning of the poem, the samajna, but the experience of enacting the poem as song, gunana, and what that experience induces in the singer listener, a movement from shabd, lowercase s, lowercase w, word, to shabd, capital W, word, from a movement from poem to sound, from sound maybe to silence, to the space between the words, from kat to akat, from sagun to nirgun, from self to non-self in a sense. So a couple of more poems around this idea of Shabd. शब्द कहाँ से उठता और कहो कहाँ को जाए, हाथ पाँव वाके नहीं फिर कैसे पकड़ा जाए. From where does the word arise? Tell me, where does it go? It has no hands or feet. How will you catch its flow? तो नाभि कमल से उठता और शून्य में जाए समाए, हाथ पाँव वाके नहीं वो सूरत से पकड़ा जाए. Arising from the navel lotus, it goes into emptiness. It has no hands or feet. It's caught by your awareness. सूरत समानी निरत में अजपा में जाप, लेख समाना अलेख में ज्यों आपा माही आप. Awareness merges with presence. The chant now chants itself. The manifest touches the unmanifest. The self returns to the self. So I'm going to play one more song for you because this is a beautiful song by Muralala Marwada ji. And I chose this song to share with you because it, in a sense, I feel describes the experience of the satsang, of the experience of the Shabd in the body. I wanted to share this song for the aforesaid reasons, but also interestingly, it is not a song by Kabir. And I think that too is important to signal and speak about, that the spirit of the truth that Kabir alludes to is confirmed, attested, established more firmly if you find it in many voices in the Dead Poets Society that is this amazing Bhakti Andolan. There were so many voices there. So I think what the satsang engenders is a kind of rejoicing in multivocality. Poets being ascribed as signatures to the same song. Sometimes you hear, and Linda will attest to this fact, that we've heard songs in the field which will sometimes be shared as Gorakhnath bhajans, and somebody else will sing it with a signature of Kabir, or even Meera and Kabir will get swapped as poets of the same song, or these songs will set up conversations between poets speaking to each other across time sometimes. The reason why the oral traditions are so relaxed about confusing these signatures is not a sloppiness or an inexactitude. This is a profound disregard as deliberate choice. I would argue that it is an integrative impulse. It is an inclusive impulse, you know, which resonates deeply with the philosophy of the poetry itself, which is to find the one in the many and not be too worried about bhed. You know, lok bhed nahi karta. So the lens that seeks to separate and isolate to understand will be flummoxed. The lens that seeks purity and authenticity will be flummoxed. For the true meaning, the true point of it all gets engendered through integration, through a blurring of categories and boundaries. So at the risk of romanticizing the satsang, I will say that, because not all satsangs are so grand. But I do believe that this amazing satsang tradition that is the vehicle of the oral traditions of this land have this quality of being, which is quite radical actually, because what it induces in you through the experience of Shabd is an understanding of social equality or non-divisiveness, which may be an idea or a value we derive through the intellect and the heart. But here in the satsang, it gets reaffirmed in the experience of something in the body, a connection to the sky, the limitlessness, the all-inclusive oneness with no borders as embodied knowledge, as an experience that something you know through the body, a knowing that you continually refresh through the body. So I'm going to now really end with a song which speaks of this quality and brings together the idea of sky again. जात हमारी आत्मा, प्राण हमारा नाम, अलख हमारा इष्ट है, गगन हमारा गाम. My caste is my soul, this life breath, my name. My religion is the alak, unseen, and in the sky, my home. Anal akasa ghar kiya, madhya nirantar vas. Vasudha vyom birkat rahe, bina thor vishwas. In the sky, the phoenix makes a home, in between forever. Heaven and earth have no allure. Her faith in placelessness is raksha, bina thor vishwas. And the song that I will end with is a song from the Kutch oral tradition of Kabir, which says, Ari gagan ma jyot jalant hai, enu akhand bhayo ujvalo, gagan ma. Mharo pirbu rame chhe niradharo, gagan ma. Ram rame chhe rangaro, gagan ma. Hey, Ari gagan ma jyot jalant hai. Nenu yakhandaya mujhe bharo gagan. Gagan hare Ram Rame Rangaro Haro Pir Bhura Me Chandira Dharo Gagan Gagan Hare Ram Rame Rangaro Hey Yari Gagan Mahabhata Bhage Hey Yari Gagan Mahabhata Bhage Henu Hinu Hinu Yagana Karo Gagan Gagan Hare Ram Rame Rangaro Dharo Pir Bhura Me Chandira Dharo Gagan Hare Ram Rame Rangaro Hey Guru Mukha Ginyani Ho Sata Guru Aage Hey Guru Mukha Ginyani Ho Sata Guru Aage Mati jaye jama tha phera re gagan hare ram rame rangaro Maro pir bhura me chandira dharo gagan Gagan Hare Ram Rame Rangaro Hey Kahata Kabira Oh Suno Bhai Sadhu Hey Kahata Kabira Oh Suno Bhai Sadhu Devayan ghadiya tirath kone bharya gagan gagan hare ram rame rangaro ram rame rangaro Hari
Thank you, Shabnam, for that profound exploration of the living oral tradition and its myriad characteristics. I think your brilliant and soulful renditions are clear evidence that this poetry was really meant to be sung out loud and shared rather than read from a printed page. So our next speaker, Professor Linda Hess, taught in the Department of Religious Studies at Stanford University for 21 years, retiring in 2017. She was the founding co-director of Stanford's Center for South Asia and co-director of the Peace and Justice Studies Initiative. Her life work has centered on Kabir, and she's written 3 big books on him: The Bijak of Kabir, Singing Emptiness on Kumar Gandharv and Kabir, and most recently, Bodies of Song, Kabir Oral Traditions and Performative Worlds in North India, from Oxford. She's also written about the 16th century poet Tulsidas and the Ram Leela in Varanasi that dramatizes Tulsi's devotional rendition of the Ramayana. So Linda's energy is quite remarkable, and I can attest that she's able to give brilliant scholarly guidance at the end of a long day while driving through Bangalore traffic. So if Kabir's poetry can keep one as energetic, vibrant, and young at heart as Linda, then I believe it must be a kind of philosopher's stone or elixir of life of some kind. So over to you, Linda.
Thank you, Pratiti. Thank you, everybody. Definitely elixir. Elixir actually is coming up in the poems that I will share with you today. Well, how lucky am I to have been associated with these two people? I'm pointing to my screen, right? They're not really in the room. For so many years, and to have had so much fun with both of them. Really. Thank you, Kabir, for bringing us all together. So we're all talking in response to this question, who is Kabir and where should we look to find him? And we're all sharing experiences that we've had in trying to answer that question. Jack and Shabnam started from very different points. They learned different things. They presented their learning in different ways, but they know and love and appreciate each other's work and wouldn't want to get along without it. They also overlap. That is, well, I won't go into the details of that. They overlap. While each started with her or his own methodology, they've evolved toward appreciating the other methodology, which I'm going to characterize as historical and written modes on one hand, oral and performative modes on the other. And I'm going to perform a bit of exquisite oversimplification. I'll call them method 1 and method 2. One is written and, as Jack has shown us, also visual and other kinds of fixed records that can be traced historically. And number 2 is immersion in music, performance, and social worlds in the present time. And my own career has embodied full pivots from 1 to 2 and back again to 1. But when I went back to focusing on written texts fairly recently, it was with a different body and mind. And that was a body and mind filled with music and with the experience of human lives, including several of those that Shabnam referred to. But at the same time, it was always, whether in the world of written and fixed records or in the world of that fluid oral tradition, that dynamic oral tradition, always it was filled with texts. The texts of poetry associated with the name of Kabir are central to all three of us. So I'm going to spend the first, I don't know how, a few minutes, up to 10, talking about my previous work. And then the other half approximately of my time introducing you to my current project, which is translating a 400-year-old manuscript collection of Kabir. Long ago, when I didn't know anything about history or manuscripts, I studied and translated a well-known collection of Kabir, the Bijak, which is regarded as a sacred book by the Kabir Panth. As a grad student in comparative literature, I only knew that my job was to study written texts. And for my PhD thesis on Kabir, I also had to study the history of the written collections. And all this work kind of came out in various publications in the 1980s. The book that was the Bijak, originally published in 1983, got a new life with help from Jack Hawley, who helped me get a new edition out in 2002 from Oxford University Press. He just helped me make the connections to get that done. I'm now going to try to share my screen, and I'm praying that it works. Is it working? Yes, right? Okay, so this is the 2002 Oxford publication of the Bijak of Kabir, which was originally published in 1983. In the late 90s, really in the end of 1999, I moved towards something I had long dreamed about, That is studying Kabir through living oral traditions with singers and listeners in live situations. Of course, I was slow the way academics are to get it together. I needed to get a grant. I needed to arrange a long stay in India. So I finally started this project in 2002. This experience, which lasted from 2002 till the publication of my last book in 2015, transformed not only my work, but my life. Just a few little quick sights of the scenes of being, wait a minute, I've got things in the wrong order. Okay, anyway, here's the mandali of Prahlad Singh Tipania, who many of you will have heard. There's Shabnam in the background there. We've been in many, many places together. Here's another place where we were together in the Shil Nabdhuni Sansthan in Devas. There we are sitting among all the other people listening to a mandali, which in a place which has fantastic kind of historical connections with the singing of Kabir in that region, and the connection of Kabir with the Nathpanthis. Oh yeah, just to show you, you know, many of you who've had anything to do with life in India, who live in India, will know that it's not all just singing. There's lots of ritual and ceremonial and meals and things like that. So there we are lighting the lamp for that occasion. Here's another scene in a great village performance, late at night. And here's another scene from one of Shabnam's films of Prahladji's first visit to America. And there I am over there, and I had the great fun and good fortune of sitting next to them to translate on the stage and singing along with them. That was really fun. And they even trusted me, that's as far as it would go, to hold the ghungroo and shake the ghungroo. That's as much as I could be trusted with for being a musician. So if you tried singing, like in that first year, I was singing every day. I'm not a singer, but I could sing. It's folk music, anybody can do it. Try singing day after day, try traveling week after week through villages, towns, and cities with Kabir singers, among devotees and fans immersed in the physical and emotional, social, musical, imaginative, and intellectual worlds where Kabir is sung and valued. That will change you. It will change you the way you think about Kabir's poetry. But it won't separate you from studying the poetry, the words, the way they come together and get written down and changed and captured in other media like cassettes or emails and websites. Anyway, so I was enthralled by this world, and for a while I was rather overly enthusiastic. So I used to say, I sometimes said, and oh, what are you just worried? Why are you just involved with books? Why don't you get out there where the living tradition is operating? But really, yeah, life is full of surprises. I was entirely caught up with the oral traditions, the living, breathing, singing, dynamic experience of Kabir, eating, drinking, dreaming oral traditions for 13 years. And I thought I had become a different kind of person from the older style scholars who were studying and editing old manuscripts. So now guess what I'm doing? I'm working and translating a big manuscript that's 400 years old. I don't have time to tell you how that happened, but it happened. I'm collaborating with a Czech scholar in Prague, Jaroslav Strinad. He's doing the critical edition of the manuscript. I'm translating it. Our project has been fortunately accepted by a series called the Murti Classical Library of India, to be published by Harvard University Press. And this work has also turned out to be an incredibly interesting, challenging. Sometimes it's grinding and boring to do poem after poem and consult dictionary after dictionary, but often it's just amazing and enthralling process. Now, I want to go back to if I find my cursor, to a slide that was out of order. Yeah. A quick snapshot of early records we have of Kabir's poetry. All the evidence suggests that he didn't write anything. Now, when did he die? I say, ask Jack. Jack, you know, everybody up until Jack said he lived in the 15th century. And I'm not going to argue that out, and I'm incapable of arguing that out. Jack today argued that he actually lived in the 16th, but people say 1448, 1518, or ask him what he thinks when Kabir died. But the importance of that approximate date is like how long he was gone before we have written records of his poetry. So the people who we can thank for making these records that we have access to are the Panth and the Sampradayas, certain ones, the sectarian organizations who were very much involved in collecting bhakti poetry. So the most important early collections for Kabir are these. First of all, the earliest of all, as far as I know, the Goindwal Pothis, partial precursors to the Guru Granth Sahib that we have manuscripts of, which are from, actually this isn't showing the dates, but anyway, from the 1570s, we don't have the exact date. Then we have the Guru Granth Sahib in its final form in 1604. The earliest dated text of Kabir, which Jack has done a lot of work with and written about, are 15 poems from the Fatehpur manuscript from Rajasthan, 1582. And then the manuscript I'm working on, the Kabir portions of a big Rajasthani Panchvani manuscript, which is dated, the dates are actually blocked out on my screen. Do you guys see them? Anyway, they're dated 1614 to 1621. It's a very clean and legible manuscript, and it's available to us in a very excellent photographed version. Now, the Bijak, which was the first book I worked on, has long been regarded as an important text, and I affirm that it's a very powerful text with great poetry, very much in the Kabir tradition. But when I first worked on it, I didn't know that we don't have any old manuscripts of the Bijak. The Kabir Panthis say that, of course, it was written down in the lifetime of Kabir, but the only attested manuscript that I have heard has been seen is from 1805, which of course isn't early at all, but it's still an important collection. Now, the manuscript that I'm working on, I'm going to kind of move on to that. I have to, whoops, all of my things are out of order here. So the manuscript that I've worked on has actually the works of 5 poets, which were favored by the Dadu Panthis. So we've culled out the Kabir poetry that's in that manuscript. It has 370, what I'll call pads, or shabads, or anyway, these song poems, the source of the songs, which would tend to be around 6 to 14 lines. It has 1,817 sakis, or very frequently called dohas, pithy, aphoristic, rhymed couplets. Then it has a whole bunch of miscellaneous poems just put together under the heading of Ramayani. While we'll never know exactly what came out of Kabir's mouth, we do have a kind of widely shared profile of Kabir. So if anybody, all the people who may be listening and watching this, many of you live in India, grew up in India, and Kabir was part of your culture. If so, what comes to your mind if I ask you to describe Kabir? How would you characterize him, just from whatever you've heard? Think about this. Maybe it can come up again in the discussion, or there's some way for you to write your comments and questions in an email. This profile is distinct to Kabir, even though we might argue over what should go in it. Excuse me, where's my cursor? There it is. So I just have made a few little categories, which are not, which could be changed and which are kind of fluid, but I'm just gonna, so we can have something to talk about. And these categories correspond to what may be in people's profile in your mind and heart of Kabir. One thing he's well known for is a critical voice. He's critical of dishonesty. I'm going to read this out. Hypocrisy, cruelty, stupidity, hierarchy, prejudice, caste, narrow religious sectarianism, and he takes his shots at Hindus and Muslims and Jaids and Shaktas, to name a few. His criticism is directed at individuals, how all of these things are exposed in us, and also at the social scene. So some people think of him as a social critic, but the inner and the outer always imply each other. So the other category that I've just made up for today is wake-up calls. There are all kinds of direct addresses to the listener. He's always saying, hey, listen, hey, you, hey, Pundit, hey, Sant, hey, truth seeker, hey, yogi. Sometimes, hey, you fool. There's in these wake-up calls, sometimes the local category is the chetavani, the warning, warning you that you're in trouble if you don't wake up. A lot of emphasis on death and impermanence and how we try to deny and escape them, but how they're always like right over us. A lot of psychological insights and observations, a lot of playfulness and satire. The other next category that I also mentioned, like I had interviewed a lot of people. One of them was the great singer Shubha Mudgal, who said to me one day, Kabir is quite rude. And she quoted some lines saying, about goats and yogis and pundits and stuff. But one of the ones in my manuscript that I'm working on now starts out, hey, pundit, which dumb idea has grabbed hold of you? You miserable man, you're not saying Ram's name, tangled up in confusion and habit, your worthless birth fizzled out. Pundit, you read Vedas and Puranas like a donkey hauling sandalwood. And then it goes on like that for a while. And at the end it says, Kabir says, when you're free of stupid ideas, that God you're worshiping will be one with you. The third category I'm referring to is experiences of ultimate reality or actual awakening. It tends to be in Kabir in non-dual terms, but the non-duality is often mingled with the theistic language of God. He very often uses yogic language to describe the processes and experiences in the body and beyond the body, and simultaneously in and beyond. As Shabnam was saying, that gagan, that sky is at once the space of the skull and the great gagan, and that we experience in our practice or in our fortunate awakenings when the boundary between the self and the great cosmos disappears. So much yogic language, very interesting topic. These poems are profound, strange, joyful, startling in their imagery, and they include the paradoxical and nonsensical language called ulit balsi, or upside down language. Finally, I'm mentioning the language of lover and beloved, or supplication, sometimes union, more often longing and suffering in separation, which we know in the broader bhakti traditions as viraha. This style is more typical of Krishna bhakti than of what I'm referring to as the Kabir profile, but it is there in all the collections and in all the popular songs. Something particular about Kabir is that often a poem which will refer to the lover and the beloved will then switch to a yogic or a kind of non-dual register. It may say, your lover is right here inside of you, or sit still in meditation if you want to meet your lover. Now, to conclude, I'm going to read out some poems from this manuscript in English translation. And I'd like to say, you know, again, what amazing good luck it's been that I've had a chance to now work on some of the very earliest historical records of Kabir poetry. And I've had a chance to be immersed in the today, in Kabir today. And what a lucky person I am to have been able to have experience, at least to some extent, this great span of Kabir through all these centuries. So I'm going to read these poems out in English translation, which is kind of weird. Our audience is going to be mostly Indian. I'm sure you would like to hear the Hindi. So it's just another weird thing about our global world that we're living in, that I'm presenting you your Kabir, your own Kabir, in English. It's all available in Hindi, and of course, I don't know, if you get in touch with me, I'll send you all the poems in Hindi. These are drafts, they're not final versions. They're all work in progress. I just want to see if oh yeah, okay. I'm going to unshare the screen if I can, so that I can just read you the poetry. Okay. Here we go. It's amazing. A lion took the cows out grazing. A son was born before his mother. A guru touched her student's feet. A fish gave birth up in a tree. A chicken caught and ate the cat. Branches down, roots up high, a million flowers bloom in the sky. Kabir says, do you get this song? You'll see the three worlds before too long. The next poem is one of a whole bunch of poems that come in this manuscript that use the imagery of a country still, that where you make liquor. And it's quite technically, you know, represents the still. Prahladji told me, he said, oh yeah, there's these tubes and these pipes, and it goes from one to the other, but it's kind of converted to a yogic process inside the body. And many of the poems talk about getting drunk and being drunk with the juice that comes out of the still. Hey brother, give a shout for Ram. Shiva and the Vedic sages were drunk with this juice, and even today they can't get enough. I built a still with pipes right and left. I lit the fire of knowledge, clothed sun and moon and 10 doors, yoga's double lock clicked shut. My drunk mind kept quaffing the juice. Nothing else tasted good. The Ganges turned backwards, the water flowed, a nectar stream trickled down. I brought 5 pals along, they all got tipsy, drinking from the cup of love. That sleeping female snake woke up. The guru made me taste the juice of boundless ease, of emptiness, of consciousness. Kabir says, I'm so drunk with the juice, I'll never sober up. Okay, next one. Let's go, they all say. But where is heaven? They have no clue. They can't find a place 10 miles away, but they'll give you a full description of heaven. As long as you're hoping for heaven, you're not dwelling at the feet of God. It's hearsay. Why would anyone believe you when you've never gone there? Kabir says, how can I explain? The community of truth seekers is heaven. I see Shabnam is smiling about the satsang. Okay, next one. Friend, how to talk about talk. Talking destroys the essence. Talking perverts the truth. But how can we think if we don't talk? A wise one's talk is helpful. A fool's talk is drivel. If you meet a true seeker, have a conversation. If you meet a truth twister, get out of the way. Kabir says, a half full pot jiggles, one that's full is still. Here's one from the lover and beloved genre. After countless days, my dearest is here, sitting in my house. What luck! A joyful song rises from my heart. My tongue tastes the elixir of Ram. The temple blazes with light as I sleep with my beloved, my lover. I was in despair, but I stumbled on treasure. Not my doing, it's all your bounty. Kabir says, I did nothing. Oh friend, Ram gave me the bliss of being his wife. What to say of those who turn away from love? Be scared of them. They can't offer a handful of water, but they're quick to insult one who brings forth the Ganges. They drown and pull others down. They set fire to the temple and go to sleep in it. Being blind, they call others one-eyed. When Kabir sees them, he is definitely scared. There's a few more here. No one can hold this body together. Think, check it out in your mind. The looter weeps while he steals. Burnt up, you'll be gone like a hoofprint in the sand. The family you cared for will smash your skull and light a fire under the sky. Kabir says, listen, folks, Hari's the one who holds things together. And here's a little short one that starts, who dies? Who dies? Hey, all you scholars, enlighten us. Dust enters dust. Wind joins with wind. Kabir says, listen, you highly qualified experts. Forms die. The whole world sees that. I have a couple more. I have no idea how much time I used, but I'll read them and then we can decide. Ram, tell me now, how many more days? When, dear Lord, will my breath be absorbed into you? So many births and deaths, drifting deluded in this world. Govind, I never saw you even for a moment. Lost, I fell and fell again into the ocean of life. Now I have no strength. Kabir says, hey, shatterer of pain, hey, destroyer of harmful deeds, have mercy. And here's the last one. What color is King Ram? It's like the fragrance of flowers. He arranged 5 elements the usual way, then infused them with 8,400,000 living beings, each with its own distinct form, each in its own place. As the fire makes each pot special, he enters, sensitive to the vessel's nature. I wish to explain this, but can't quite say it. It's like the creatures in water aren't separate from the water. All souls, recognizing they exist, are deceived when they dwell in that recognition. I recognize, stuck to that view, they fall for the ruse. Self and other are one. Seeing that is nirvana, says Kabir. God is here. Says Kabir, my mind's at ease. God is here. Harm and suffering cease. Okay.
Thank you, Linda, for this expansive view of your work on Kabir, from the written to the oral, now back to your work on this manuscript, these wonderful translations. Thank you also for giving us a broad understanding of some of the themes that one encounters in Kabir. You've charted a kind of roadmap of the terrain, criticism, wake-up calls, experiences of ultimate reality, and the language of lover and beloved. I think this is a good starting point for a discussion.
Shabnam, as you talked, I found myself thinking time and again about, well, Gagan or Asman, the sort of that to which we climb, and how there's the confidence that we can climb inside, that our bodies equip us for the way in which we're positioned in the world. It's striking, it made me think of a particular Kabir poem, a poem that's actually about weaving, about being the master of a loom, in which he speaks of the weaver apparently not just as a human being, perhaps himself, but also as the person who is the person who is somehow behind the Asman and the Gagan, the sky that we also are able to take in with ourselves. And it reminded me of a particular poem that Linda has translated, which appears in the, as a Ramayani actually, in the Bijak of Kabir. And here's the text of that poem, but what we're going to see is that as I wandered through Michigan these past 3 months, I found myself in the presence of a very different version of this same old poem. Linda's punctiliously made the caveat that our oldest manuscript of the Bijak dates back only to 1805, but undoubtedly it represents an oral tradition that is much older. And that oral tradition is actually given evidence in the fact that we have a Rajasthani version that must have been built on this. So let's just look at this one, which is in the Bijak, which will conform, I think, Shabnam, to your sense of how things should fit together. Asujolaha kahu maramana jana, jin jaga ani pasarani dana, dharate akasha do ghada kharaya, chand surya do nari banaya, sahasra tarale purni puri, ajho bane kathina hai duri, kahe Kabir karma se jodi, soot ku soot bine jal kori. Linda translates this in this way. It says, no one knows the secret of the weaver who spread his warp throughout the universe. He dug 2 ditches, sky and earth. By the way, she gives us a footnote there, and she points out, don't you, Linda, that for a loom of the kind that Kabir would have woven on, you have to dig a couple of ditches to get it actually based in where it is in the earth. And then, oh gosh, there's more to say. You can say it, Linda, perhaps in a bit. He dug 2 ditches, sky and earth, made 2 spools, sun and moon, filled his shuttle with 1,000 threads. The word tar there, I think, also suggests the stars, and weaves till today a difficult length. Kabir says they're joined by actions, good threads and bad. That fellow weaves both. So it's a poem that has coherence. It's a poem, even surprisingly, where the last line, here it is again, makes a kind of moral reference. It's not just good people in the world or good things in the world, but bad things that the weaver, the kori, manages somehow to weave together. Now look what happens to this poem, and this is what was, how shall I say it, eerie to me as I walked around Michigan and looked at the, you know, the Gagan, the Asman, found myself once again in the presence of, dare I call it the real world? From a New York point of view, it's not real at all. It's so far away, and yet somehow it's just behind what we're able to see in our little New Yorks. That's where I found myself walking at the end of every day in Michigan. And here's the Rajasthani version of the poem, thanks to the addition of Aparasnath Tiwari working in the 1960s. You'll hear a lot of the same things, but you'll hear some differences too. And this echoes to Linda's work about the Rajasthani versions today even. Kori ko kahu maramana jana, sab jago ani tanayo tana, dharati akas ki karg hai banaye, chand suraju due nari chalaye, sahaj tar le purna puri, ajho bane katin hai duri, kahta Kabir karg hai tori, sute sut melai kori. The end is totally different. Here's an attempt to translate. That master weaver, whose skills are beyond our knowing, has stretched his warp through the world. He has fastened his loom between sky and earth, earth and sky, where the shuttlecocks are the sun and moon. He fills the shuttle with the threaded easy spontaneity and weaves an endless pattern. Beautiful poem, a lovely picture of the weaver behind the world. And now, But now, says Kabir, that weaver, he breaks apart his loom and tangles the thread in thread. As I was walking around Michigan, I was amazed to find myself inside that actual drama. I'd go over the end point of the walk would take me to the shore of Lake Michigan, and oddly, I would often arrive exactly at sunset without having planned it. This amazing scape, I don't even know what kind of scape to call it, which we're surrounded with, that is beyond our bodies, you know? If we have somehow Asman that is part of us, but gosh, it's there in the world into which we're born too. And then one night, it was, I think, Jesht Purnima, I found myself turning back the other way and finding, sure enough, there was that other shuttlecock, the moon, before my eyes. So it was distressing to me to think that here in my little lake that leads out into Lake Michigan, the dock that we've carefully built out into that lake so as to make it our own really leads only so far. The lake is deeper and it's more complicated and there is no end to it. How could the weaver manage? How could the weaver think of actually destroying that loom? That's what I found so hard to accept.
Well, maybe I would just like to respond to this very moving and impassioned poetry by Jack and say, I don't know what it means, but in so many of Kabir's songs, he will speak of death as a precursor to rebirth, a rejuvenation, a burning of the house. Like in one poem, he says, burn your house, a new one arises. Cling to your house and it's gone before your eyes, you know. So I think the destruction, or he will say in another poem, Balihari va rukhadi, jad kaate ne phal hoye. You know, you hack at the root and there is fruit. Let us, I guess, keep that spirit at heart, that in the heart of all destruction and death is an opportunity for renewal, because I think that's the spirit that Kabir invokes.
Well, on that note, perhaps we should conclude, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us today from across the world and taking the time. I know you all have very busy schedules right now, so thank you, and I guess we'll hear from the audience shortly. Thanks.